History remembers kings for conquest, wisdom, or legacy, but some are remembered for horrors too cruel to name. In the lost heart of ancient Lydia, one monarch sought divinity through desire, turning pleasure into punishment and faith into pain. His empire was not built on gold or war, but on the bodies of those who worshipped and feared him. This is the forgotten reign of Basilius of Lydia, the king who turned lust into torture. In the twilight of the Hellenistic world, Lydia stood like a fading ember among greater flames, a land of marble courtyards and decaying gods. When King Basilius ascended the throne, he was barely 20. He inherited not only a fractured realm, but an age obsessed with beauty, ritual, and divine flesh. To him, the body was the purest expression of power, and control over the body, the highest form of kingship. From the beginning, the young monarch was different. He had been raised in the temples of Cybele, where priests taught that suffering purified desire. His tutors said he read philosophy by day and watched punishment rituals by torchlight at night. In every agony, he saw symmetry. In every cry, he found rhythm. Pain, he once murmured to his physician, is the only prayer the flesh understands. When his father's counselors urged restraint, Basilius dismissed them. He saw the state not as a burden of governance, but as a stage for transformation, where discipline would breed devotion. His first decree outlawed disobedience in the palace, not through execution, but through what he called reconditioning of pleasure. No one knew what that meant until the first noble was summoned. Witnesses later wrote that the king's rule began not with war, but with whispers. Servants carried tales of his fascination with control, the way he lingered near the training pits, observing bound captives as if studying a sacred text. In the evenings, the palace air grew heavy with incense and fear. It was said that Basilius's laughter echoed from rooms sealed to all but his favorites. He surrounded himself with poets, sculptors, and priests, those who could clothe cruelty in art. They called him Eros Reborn, the embodiment of both pleasure and punishment. Under his gaze, the court learned that beauty could not exist without suffering. Dancers performed until their bodies collapsed, and musicians were ordered to play as whips sang behind velvet curtains. The more exquisite the sound, the more violent the silence that followed. But beneath the marble calm, something darker grew. The people began to speak of the chambers of discipline, where the king sought perfection through humiliation. Slaves vanished. Lovers reappeared changed, their eyes hollow, their smiles rehearsed. The chronicler Demetrius of Pergamon, who served briefly in Lydia, wrote, "He ruled not as man but as the sculptor of souls, carving obedience into flesh." Still, the world admired him. His empire flourished on the surface, trade routes thrived, temples glittered, and ambassadors from distant lands praised his composure. None could see the sickness beneath the silk. Basilius's hands, always immaculate, hid the tremor of obsession. He had begun to believe his reign was divine, that through orchestrated pain, he could cleanse the corruption of humanity itself. At night, he walked through his palace corridors barefoot, touching the cold stone as if it were skin. He often paused before the statue of Aphrodite, whispering prayers no priest could decipher. "Desire without discipline is chaos," he told her stone face. "But discipline without desire is death." By the end of his third year, the palace had changed. The murals once depicting gods of love now portrayed acts of submission and endurance. Musicians no longer sang of victories, but of silence, breath, and control. Those who questioned him were not executed, they were taught devotion. No rebellion rose, no army challenged him. Yet within the heart of Lydia, a quiet dread spread like rot beneath gold leaf. The king's obsession with divine order had begun to consume his humanity. What began as philosophy was turning into ritual. What began as beauty was becoming horror. And beneath the marble floors of the palace, workers whispered of something new being built, a chamber none dared enter, where screams would soon become prayer. Beneath the palace of Lydia, where marble reflected torchlight like liquid fire, the first chamber of the flesh was constructed. It began as an architectural curiosity, a secret hall ordered by King Basilius for matters of purification. None but his most trusted artisans knew its purpose. What they built would soon become the beating heart of his dark theology. The entrance was hidden behind the colonnades of the royal baths. A narrow stair descended into silence, where walls glimmered with mosaics depicting gods in ecstasy and torment. The air smelled of myrrh, iron, and burnt oil. There were no guards, only attendants whose eyes were veiled, their tongues ritually cut to preserve secrecy. They moved like shadows, performing duties they no longer understood. In this subterranean shrine, Basilius developed what he called the doctrine of obedience through flesh. He believed pain was not punishment, but transformation, that the soul could ascend through disciplined suffering. His victims were chosen with ceremony: prisoners, debtors, slaves, even courtiers accused of vanity or disloyal thought. All were told they had been selected for redemption. None returned whole. Each night, the king descended alone, his golden robe traded for a simple linen cloth. He walked barefoot upon the stone, touching the walls as if tracing scripture. The chamber contained no chains in its early days, only instruments of intimacy turned to instruments of control. The rituals began with gentle command, the surrender of voice, the yielding of movement. Then came endurance, the testing of limits under the guise of devotion. The chroniclers called these acts lessons of harmony, but those who survived spoke of mutilation veiled in ritual. A former servant, writing in exile, described it as a theater where pleasure was dissected to reveal its bones. Basilius spoke softly during the ordeals, guiding each act like a priest conducting liturgy. "You are not punished," he would murmur. "You are purified." His priests observed from alcoves above, recording the sessions as sacred doctrine. They catalogued reactions, documenting which degrees of agony produced tears, silence, or ecstasy. From these records, Basilius claimed to glimpse divine order, a formula binding pain to obedience. The chamber thus became his laboratory of faith, and Lydia's morality began to twist around it. Soon, whispers escaped the palace walls. Servants spoke of laughter beneath the earth, followed by sudden stillness. The city's markets filled with rumors that the king sought immortality through the body's corruption. Mothers forbade their daughters from temple service. Priests prayed with trembling hands. Yet none dared confront him. The chamber had become sacred, a symbol of the king's divine right to rule. Over time, its architecture expanded. Euphoron the sculptor was summoned to carve reliefs of human figures intertwined, half in worship, half in agony. The ceiling was inlaid with mirrors so that suffering reflected infinitely. The king called it the Eye of the Gods. At dawn, Basilius would ascend the stairs, his body unmarked but his eyes alight with fever. "They understand now," he whispered to his attendants. "They see that obedience is beauty." He ordered incense to be burned in the palace halls to mask the scent that followed him, a mingling of blood and perfumed oil. By his 5th year of rule, no law in Lydia was greater than his doctrine. The chamber beneath the palace had become the foundation of his kingdom, a sanctuary for the worship of control, where devotion was measured by endurance. And still, each night, more steps were added to the stairway, leading deeper into the earth, as if even hell itself was being carved by royal decree. Euphoron of Ephesus arrived in Lydia as an artist, not a torturer. His hands had once carved angels from ivory and gods from stone. When summoned by King Basilius, he believed he was to design monuments, temples to celebrate the king's new philosophy of order and beauty. What he discovered instead was a commission that would stain his name for eternity. The king met him in the Hall of Mirrors, where the polished walls reflected their faces 100-fold. Basilius spoke gently, his words wrapped in the cadence of philosophy. "Art," he said, is the discipline of form. Suffering gives it soul. I wish for you, Euphron, to give shape to obedience itself." The sculptor bowed, uncertain whether he had heard a metaphor or a command. He was taken to the chamber beneath the palace, the secret sanctum known only to the initiated. There, Euphron saw what no artist should see. The marble floors bore marks of cleansing, the air heavy with the scent of oil and something older, rawer. The king explained his vision: instruments that would teach harmony through pain, devices both beautiful and terrible, the merging of sculpture and punishment. At first, Euphron hesitated. Yet Basilius's influence was absolute. Refusal meant disgrace, or worse, redemption in the very devices he refused to build. And so the sculptor obeyed. He began crafting under the king's direction, bronze chains shaped like serpents, whose coils constricted when heated, a throne inlaid with gems that hid barbed mechanisms beneath the armrests, a chair of polished wood that bent with the weight of its occupant until bone and structure aligned. The king called them instruments of enlightenment. Each creation was inspected personally. Basilius would run his fingers across the curves, admiring the blend of beauty and menace. "Perfection," he whispered, "is when pain becomes silent." Euphron nodded, though his stomach churned. In his private notes, later discovered centuries after Lydia's fall, he confessed, "I sculpt not marble but conscience. Every chisel stroke hollows something inside me." Soon, the chamber of the flesh transformed into a gallery of sacred suffering. Nobles visited under pretense of philosophical devotion, pretending awe while trembling beneath the surface. The instruments gleamed like divine relics, each given a name from myth: the embrace of Hera, the kiss of Dionysus, the wings of Icarus. What appeared artistic became ritualistic. Euphron's fame spread across the Aegean. Other rulers sought his designs, unaware of their purpose. The king rewarded him lavishly: gold, land, even slaves for companionship. Yet at night, Euphron could not sleep. He heard echoes of metal and breath, the murmurs of those who had ascended through his craft. The palace's beauty had become a cathedral of agony, and he its unwilling architect. One evening, he confronted Basilius, trembling. "Majesty," he said softly, "these works dishonor the gods. They are tools of ruin." The king smiled, calm as marble. "No, Euphron. They honor the truth. The gods built us from pain. I merely remind us what we are." After that night, Euphron never spoke against him again. But something inside him fractured. He continued his work, hollow and obedient, as the chamber grew more elaborate, more sacred, more depraved. By the end of the 6th year, Euphron's art had reshaped the entire palace. Every corridor bore his carvings, bodies entwined in torment, faces frozen between agony and ecstasy. Visitors called it the living temple. The king called it the path to purity. And Euphron, staring at his own reflection in polished bronze, realized too late that he had become both creator and prisoner, sculptor and sacrifice in the same design. Once every lunar cycle, the kingdom of Lydia surrendered to a night where boundaries dissolved between devotion and madness. The festival of obedience was not a celebration of faith. It was a theater of domination, born from the king's conviction that pain was the purest form of worship. The moon was the witness, the fire the altar, and the flesh of the subjects the sacred offering. As twilight faded, the palace transformed into a sanctum of dread. Tapestries depicting scenes of divine torment lined the marble corridors. The scent of myrrh mixed with blood from ritual cuts upon the attendants' wrists. At the center of the grand courtyard stood the king, draped in crimson robes embroidered with golden serpents, the symbol of both creation and destruction. Around him gathered nobles, courtiers, and slaves, their eyes trembling between fear and reverence. "The gods demand ecstasy through agony," the king proclaimed, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "To suffer is to serve." His words were met not with cheers, but with silence, the silence of submission. The ritual began with the offering of flesh. Each noble family presented a gift to the king: servants, concubines, or sometimes their own kin. These offerings were not sacrifices in the divine sense, but demonstrations of loyalty, tokens of endurance. The chosen ones were adorned with silver chains and painted in sacred oils before being led to the dais of endurance. There, beneath the eyes of the court, they were tested through pain designed not to kill, but to purify. To please the king was to survive his attention. He watched as his subjects endured whips carved with sacred inscriptions, their cries echoing like hymns. He called it the music of redemption. The nobles forced smiles, hiding their disgust, knowing that any show of pity could be mistaken for defiance. The queen, veiled in mourning silk, stood beside the throne. Her gaze never wavered, though inside her, the hollow of her heart deepened with each scream. The man she once loved had turned into something divine and monstrous, a ruler who believed cruelty was enlightenment. His faith had become infection. As the moon reached its zenith, the festival reached its peak. Euphorin, the royal artisan, unveiled a new device, a rotating wheel of polished bronze designed to test the endurance of the willing. The king called for volunteers, and nobles pushed their servants forward in trembling lines. The wheel spun, its motion rhythmic, almost mesmerizing, as the screams blended with the chants of priests who recited verses from the Book of Purification. Those who survived the ordeal were marked upon their backs with the royal sigil, a serpent devouring its own tail. Those who collapsed were not mourned, but mocked as weak. Their bodies were dragged away by masked attendants, never to be seen again. Before dawn, the king descended from his throne to bless the altar. His hands, soaked in the mingled blood of noble and slave, trembled with a strange serenity. "Tonight," he whispered, "Lydia is reborn through devotion." But outside the palace walls, the air was different. The city watched in silence as torches flickered within the courtyard, knowing the cries they heard were not those of sinners, but of victims. The festival of obedience had become the kingdom's most sacred sin, a night when worship meant surrender, and silence meant survival. And as dawn crept upon the blood-stained marble, Queen Alithia turned her eyes to the dying stars and murmured, "If obedience is holiness, then I shall sin." The morning after the festival of obedience dawned heavy with the scent of ash and incense. The courtyard still glistened with blood that servants scrubbed from the marble. The king slept soundly, lulled by his own righteousness, but Queen Alithia could not close her eyes. Beneath the painted ceiling of her chamber, she saw faces, the broken, the forgotten, the ones who had screamed for mercy that never came. Once, Alithia had been the jewel of Lydia. Her beauty was sung in ballads. Her laughter echoed through the halls like spring rain. But beauty in the king's world was both crown and curse. Her grace became his ornament, her body his emblem of dominance. Every smile he forced upon her was a command, every touch an assertion of divine right. The queen learned that silence was not weakness, it was camouflage. The festival had shown her the truth. Her husband's mind was no longer mortal. His faith had rotted into madness. He called it devotion, but it was hunger, a thirst to own even the pain of others. Alithia began to wonder whether the gods themselves had abandoned Lydia or were laughing at its ruin. In secret, she began to gather those who had suffered most. Broken courtiers, servants marked by the whip, mothers who had lost their children to the king's rituals. They came to her chambers at night, their steps muffled by candlelight. There, beneath the eyes of painted saints, she spoke softly, not of rebellion, but of survival. "If holiness demands blood," she whispered, "then let us bleed with purpose." Among her followers was Manan, a priest whose faith had cracked beneath the weight of what he had witnessed. He brought her scrolls, forbidden writings that spoke of old prophecies, of kings consumed by their own sanctity. "Even gods fall," he murmured, "and those who pretend to be them fall harder." Alithia listened, and the seed of vengeance began to take root. The queen's defiance was not loud. It was measured, meticulous. She learned the language of the palace guards, memorized their shifts, bribed servants with gold and promises of mercy. In her private chambers, she hid letters in the seams of tapestries, messages of hope to those still trapped in despair. Every candle she lit during prayer was a signal. Every tear she shed before the altar was an oath. Yet danger lurked even in silence. The king's spies, eager for favor, whispered of a shadow gathering beneath the queen's grace. Still, the king dismissed them. "She is my creation," he laughed. "A rose cannot wound the hand that waters it." His arrogance became her shield. But Alithia was no longer a rose. She had become the thorn, quiet, sharp, patient. She waited as the court decayed, as famine crept beyond the gilded gates, as faith turned into fear. Her vengeance was not for power or glory. It was for the children stolen, the servants scarred, the souls lost in the name of holiness. And so, beneath the glow of the temple lamps, the queen prayed, not to the gods her husband served, but to the forgotten spirits of the earth. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Let him taste his own devotion." Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills. The storm was coming, and it carried her name. The famine came like a slow curse. Fields once golden with wheat turned to dust, and the Euphrates ran shallow, thick with mud. The people whispered that the gods were punishing Lydia, that the king's pleasures had defiled the balance of heaven. But within the marble walls of the palace, King Basilius refused to see it as punishment. He called it a test, one that demanded an offering greater than any before. On the eve of the blood moon, the priests gathered in trembling reverence as the king announced his decree. "Purity," he said, "must be the vessel through which the land is healed." His eyes glimmered beneath the torchlight, fevered with conviction. He would summon 20 virgins from the countryside, untouched, unsullied, perfect in body and spirit. They would serve the gods through sacrifice, their innocence turned to nourishment for the dying earth. The royal decree spread like wildfire. Families wept as soldiers took their daughters in the name of the crown. The chosen were paraded through the streets like offerings already dead, veiled in white, their faces pale as milk. The people watched in silence, torn between terror and faith. Some prayed the king's madness might save them. Others prayed it would finally destroy him. In the underground halls, the same where obedience had once been taught, preparations began. Euphron, the sculptor, was ordered to fashion marble basins large enough to hold the ritual blood. He worked in silence, his hands trembling, haunted by what his art had become. When he asked the king if prayer alone could not suffice, Basilius smiled faintly. "Prayer feeds the soul," he replied, "but flesh feeds the earth." As the blood moon rose, its crimson light bled across the courtyard. The virgins were led into the temple, their feet bare, their hands bound with silk. The king stood before them adorned in robes of gold and ivory, a living idol of indulgence. He lifted his scepter and spoke words that no one dared question. To him, this was not cruelty. It was creation, a divine transaction between purity and power. But to the people who watched from the shadows, it was horror. The cries of the young echoed against stone, mingling with the chants of priests who no longer believed. Blood flowed into the marble basins, thick and glistening under torchlight. The king anointed himself with it, smearing the symbol of his own divinity upon his chest. "The gods will drink, and the land will breathe again," he declared. Outside the palace, the night carried their screams across the valley. Mothers clutched their remaining children, farmers fell to their knees, and even the wind seemed to hold their breath. The moon, swollen and red, watched in silent judgment. Queen Alithia witnessed it all from her tower. Her heart burned not only with grief, but with understanding. This was no longer just tyranny, it was desecration. Every act of the king pushed Lydia closer to ruin, and her secret rebellion grew stronger in the shadows. Among her hidden followers, whispers turned to plans. "If he drinks the blood of the innocent," she said coldly, "then let him choke on it." When dawn came, the king bathed in water turned pink by sacrifice. He declared the ritual a success, though the famine deepened and the people began to call him by a new name, the God who drinks innocence. And in that name, his downfall had already begun. Among the few who still dared whisper the truth within the palace, was Manan, a priest once revered as the keeper of sacred fire. In his youth, he had anointed King Basilius with oils of coronation, believing the boy would lead Lydia to divine glory. But over the years, Manan had watched the crown twist the king's heart into something monstrous. The temples, once filled with prayers, now echoed with screams. And the blood spilled in the name of the gods no longer sanctified, it desecrated. When the virgins of the blood moon were taken, Manan began to write. In hidden parchment scrolls, he chronicled every ritual, every sacrifice, every act of cruelty disguised as divine will. His words were not rebellion, they were confession, a desperate attempt to preserve truth before it was swallowed by fear. He titled his record, The Lament of the Gods. In these writings, Manan spoke of a king who believed himself chosen by celestial forces, but served only his lust. He described the festivals of flesh, the gilded instruments of torment, and the hollow prayers that rose with the smoke of burning innocence. If the gods remain silent, he wrote, then perhaps they have turned their faces away from us. But the king's spies heard whispers of the hidden book. One night, soldiers tore through the temple archives and found Manan's writings sealed beneath the altar. He was dragged to the great hall before the court, trembling yet unbroken. Basilius sat upon his throne of ivory, smiling with the calm of a man convinced of his own divinity. "You have written lies," the king said softly, "and called them truth." Manan did not bow. "I wrote what your eyes refused to see," he answered, "that you have become the god you once feared." The court gasped. Silence fell like stone. For a moment, Basilius simply stared, as if studying a man already dead. Then, with unsettling serenity, he ordered a new ritual. Euphorin, the sculptor, was summoned once more. The king instructed him to forge a crown, not of gold, but of iron. "A gift," he said, "for a priest who sought to carry the weight of truth." For 3 days, Euphorin labored in grief. He shaped the iron into a circlet lined with thorns and hollow channels meant to hold embers. When presented to the king, Basilius ordered the court to gather. Manan was stripped and bound to a marble pillar, his eyes fixed on the crown glowing red from the forge's fire. "The gods reward loyalty," Basilius declared, "and punish pride." The iron crown was pressed upon Manan's head, the sound of sizzling flesh filling the hall. He did not scream. He only murmured a prayer, a final plea that the land might be freed from madness. When it was done, his skull smoked, and his eyes, melted open, seemed to stare endlessly into the king's soul. Basilius, ever theatrical, declared it a divine omen. Manan's body was set upon the temple gate, his burnt crown glimmering under the sun, a warning to those who questioned the god king. But among the people, he became a martyr. They whispered that Manan's spirit lingered in the palace fires, watching, waiting, judging. And though Basilius laughed at their fear, he began to dream of the priest each night, standing silent, crowned in flame. The palace of Lydia glittered once more, not with joy, but with deceit. After the priest's execution, King Basilius sought to erase whispers of rebellion through spectacle. He announced a grand banquet, proclaiming it a feast of renewal. Invitations spread across the kingdom. Nobles, generals, scholars, and courtesans summoned to witness the king's magnanimity. To the starving land outside, it was an insult. To those within, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. Queen Alithia watched the preparations in silence, She had buried her grief behind an immaculate mask, her rebellion disguised as obedience. The virgins of the blood moon still haunted her, their screams, their faces, their blood that refused to fade from the palace stones. Her husband called it sacrifice. She called it slaughter. And now, behind the scent of wine and roses, she saw her only chance to end him. The plan was delicate, stitched together through whispers and glances. A servant girl, once spared from the chambers of obedience, would slip a tincture of nightshade into the king's cup. The dancers, trained in coded steps, would move in patterns that signaled each stage of the act. And when the final torch burned low, the loyal guards, men whose wives and daughters had vanished into the palace, would strike. That evening, the hall blazed with gold. Harps sang. Torches painted the marble with trembling shadows. The king entered draped in white silk, a serpent-shaped crown glinting upon his head. The guests rose, offering hollow applause. "Tonight," he said, lifting his goblet, "we feast not in mourning, but in triumph. For the gods have chosen to forgive us." His voice was calm, his smile almost gentle. Alithia raised her cup, her eyes fixed on the poison swirling like smoke in the wine. The dancers began their performance, graceful, hypnotic, but beneath each turn and bow lay a message. The first signal came when a veil fell. The second, when the flute slowed. Her heart pounded with each step. But as she watched the king's gaze drift toward her, she realized too late, he knew. The dancers faltered. A soldier at the end of the table reached for his sword, only to be seized by royal guards who had been waiting in silence. The servant girl was dragged forward, her trembling hand still stained with the tincture's scent. Basilius stood slowly, his voice almost tender as he said, "My queen, even rebellion looks beautiful on you." The hall turned into chaos. Guards chained the guests where they sat, locking them to the tables. The musicians were ordered to continue playing, their trembling fingers pressing notes into the growing terror. The king poured the poisoned wine into the servant girl's mouth, forcing her to swallow. When her body went limp, he turned to the nobles and smiled. "To loyalty," he toasted. The scent of roasting meat soon filled the air, but it was not from the kitchens. Several rebels were bound and dragged to braziers, their screams rising above the music. Alithia watched, her face still calm, though her nails dug into her palms until they bled. Basilius approached her, his breath heavy with wine and smoke. "You will live," he whispered, "for I have not yet found the art worthy of your punishment." The feast of betrayal ended with music, laughter, and death, a performance for the gods no longer watching. And as dawn broke, the queen realized her rebellion had only just begun. The queen awoke to darkness. The scent of oil and iron lingered in the air, heavy as grief. Her wrists were bound by silk, the same silk she once wore in the royal chambers, now twisted into chains of humiliation. When the torches flickered to life, she saw where she was, the chamber of the flesh, the place where obedience was born through agony, where nobles had once begged to please the king. Now it had become her tomb. Mirrors surrounded her on every wall, reflecting her body from every cruel angle. Golden serpents coiled along the ceiling, their jeweled eyes glinting in the dim light. The air pulsed with the faint rhythm of distant drums, the sound of celebration above, for the king's survival after the feast. King Basilius entered slowly, draped in a robe of deep crimson. His face was calm, almost sorrowful, as though mourning something sacred. "My queen," he said softly, "you have wounded me deeper than any blade could. And yet, I cannot hate you, for your rebellion was born of love." Alithia lifted her head, her eyes defiant. "Love?" she hissed. "You have forgotten what that word means." The king smiled faintly. "Then let me remind you." He gestured to Euphorin, the sculptor who once built beauty into horror. The old craftsman, pale and hollow-eyed, wheeled forth a structure of gold and glass, a throne shaped like two entwined lovers. Its design was exquisite, almost divine. But the queen knew what lay beneath such beauty. "This," said Basilius, "shall be your final throne. Not as punishment, but as union, for even in death, I wish to keep you close." He circled her slowly, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You sought to poison me. You plotted with thieves and traitors. Yet I forgive you, my heart. For only those who love truly can hate so fiercely." The ritual began. Attendants, silent, faceless, anointed her skin with perfumed oil. They bound her to the throne, her reflection multiplied 100-fold in the mirrors around her. Every movement, every tremor of fear was reflected infinitely. A cruel theater of intimacy. The king knelt before her, pressing his forehead against hers. "Let the gods witness our devotion," he murmured. Then he gave the order. The glass beneath the throne glowed as oil lamps were ignited beneath it. Heat rose slowly, creeping through the metal, searing her flesh. The queen bit her lip until it bled, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a scream. Her reflection shimmered, twisting into ghosts of agony. Basilius watched in silence, his eyes wet, his breathing uneven. "Do not think this is death," he whispered. "This is remembrance." As the flames consumed her, she spoke her last words, calm, steady, unbroken. "You will rule ashes, Basilius, and the gods you worship will devour you as you devoured us." Moments later, the mirrors shattered, shards scattering like rain across the floor. The queen's ashes drifted into the air, caught in the golden glow of the lamps. The king collected them himself, his fingers trembling as he poured them into his wine. He drank. The courtiers later said he smiled afterward, serene, almost divine, as though he had achieved a sacred communion. But those who looked closely saw something else, the faintest trace of terror behind his calm. For in every mirror, before it broke, he had seen her, still watching him, eyes burning through the glass. The empire that had once pulsed with decadence began to rot from within. The streets of Lydia, once perfumed with incense and silk, now stank of decay. Famine, long ignored, returned with vengeance. The fields yielded nothing but brittle stalks, and the rivers swelled with dead fish. The air itself felt diseased, thick, heavy, poisoned by the king's blasphemy. In the countryside, peasants abandoned their homes. The temples stood empty, their statues defaced, their priests hanged or fled. Even the sun seemed dimmer, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from what the kingdom had become. The once beautiful city that had thrived under Basilius's reign now resembled a corpse, its bones gleaming marble, its flesh eaten by hunger and plague. Inside the palace, silence replaced music. The courtiers who had once praised the king's divine pleasures now died in the corridors, their bodies stacked like offerings. The scent of death clung to every silk curtain, every golden goblet. Rats feasted upon what was left of the feasts that once defined royal life. The laughter that had once echoed through the marble halls had turned to the endless buzzing of flies. King Basilius still held his rituals. In chambers now filled with corpses instead of courtiers, he spoke to the dead as if they still adored him. He dressed their remains in fine garments, set crowns upon skulls, and dined beside them. His voice echoed across the empty hall, a single note of madness reverberating through ruin. Euphron, the sculptor, now old and broken, was forced to maintain the illusion of splendor. "Polish their bones," the king ordered him. "Let them shine for the gods." The craftsman obeyed in silence, knowing that defiance meant joining the statues of death that lined the walls. Outside, rebellion rose again, not from soldiers or nobles, but from the starving. Farmers, gravediggers, and widows gathered with torches. Chanting the queen's name instead of the king's, they said her spirit haunted the palace, guiding the wind, poisoning the earth until his reign ended. The few who dared approach the gates swore they saw her reflection in the windows, watching, waiting. When the plague came, it struck swiftly. Bodies blackened overnight. Skin peeled like parchment. Even the king's sacred guards fell in droves. Physicians tried to flee, only to collapse upon the palace steps. Lydia's once proud banners hung tattered in the wind, and the sound of mourning replaced all music. Through it all, Basilius remained untouched, or so he believed. He called the disease a trial of faith, proclaiming that only the divine would endure. Yet his reflection told another story. His skin had begun to gray, his eyes sunken and fevered. The very flesh he had worshipped as divine perfection was beginning to decay. He spoke to the empty throne beside him as if Queen Alithia still sat there. "They have betrayed us," he murmured. "But the gods still see me." When thunder rolled across the horizon, he took it as a sign of divine reply. As the last loyal servant fled, Basilius stood alone amid the ruin of his kingdom. Statues of his likeness were dragged through the streets and burned. His name became a curse, whispered by mothers to frighten their children. In the palace of rot, surrounded by the remnants of beauty and bone, King Basilius smiled faintly. He believed the world had turned its back on him, but in truth, it was he who had fallen out of the world. And in that silence his punishment had already begun. The final days of King Basilius were written not by historians, but by the silence of the dead palace that encased him. The once lustrous halls of Lydia now stood hollow, their marble veins filled with the stench of decay. The king's footsteps echoed through corridors where no reply came, save the whisper of wind through shattered glass. He had become both ruler and prisoner, a relic preserved in his own ruins. His body had begun to betray him. The disease that devoured his people now turned its fangs upon its master. His skin blistered beneath the silks he refused to remove. Sores bloomed like dark roses along his arms, and his breath carried the scent of iron and rot. Yet in his madness he called this agony divine union. He believed his body was shedding its mortal shell, preparing him for immortality, a god of suffering, crowned by his own torment. Euphoron, the last of his servants, remained only because he was forbidden to die. The sculptor's once steady hands trembled as he was summoned for one final commission, a throne unlike any before. Not of gold, the king commanded, but of bronze, shaped in the image of devotion, a lover's embrace that never releases. Euphoron obeyed, though his heart was broken and his will long extinguished. Days passed as the furnace roared. From the glowing metal, a figure emerged, two intertwined bodies, neither wholly male nor female, their limbs coiled as if in eternal union. The seat was carved between their arms, and beneath it, the hollow where fire would burn forever. It was both throne and tomb, art and abomination. When the work was complete, Basilius dismissed all remaining guards. He bathed himself in wine, perfumed his body, and adorned his head with a crown of blackened gold. The reflection in the mirror showed not a king, but a phantom, flesh-pocked and peeling, eyes glassy with fever. Still, he smiled. "Beauty," he whispered, "never dies. It only transforms." At dusk, he entered the chamber of the throne. The air shimmered with heat as the fires were lit beneath the bronze. Euphoron, weeping silently, watched from the shadows. The king disrobed, his body pale and trembling. He lowered himself onto the metal seat. At first, it was only warmth, then agony beyond language. The bronze began to glow, the sculpted arms tightening around him as the fire raged below. His screams echoed through the corridors, blending with the groan of the metal. Flesh fused with bronze, veins burst like ribbons of molten wax. But Basilius did not plead for mercy. He laughed, a sound both pitiful and triumphant, and cried out to the gods he had long forsaken. "Now you see me. Now you must envy me." By morning, the fires had dimmed. Where a man once sat, there remained only a statue, half flesh, half metal, mouth open in what seemed like a smile. Euphorin approached and placed a final wreath of olive leaves upon the throne. Then, at last, he took his chisel and shattered his own heart with it. The palace collapsed months later. Strangers who dared to wander its ruins swore they heard a low hum from beneath, the stones like a voice still whispering prayers. The ashes of Basilius were said to be mixed with gold dust and scattered by the few who survived him, though none dared speak his name. For in Lydia, to utter it was to invite his curse, the belief that beauty could outlive the soul. And so ended the flesh kingdom, not with rebellion, but with the laughter of a man who became his own punishment.